All right, so episode 2 of Just Feudal Things. Today we're talking with Robert Rust, and I have a quick question for you because we all know that the medieval period was very dark and everybody was dirty and they didn't wash their hands and they were covered in poop and they only lived to be 12 years old. Did they have music?
They had a lot of music. Like it's kind of astonishing how much music that we actually have from the Middle Ages, and then even going further into the Renaissance. It's more music than honestly we even nowadays know what to do with. It's considerable.
So that's pretty interesting because I think a lot of times we think about the Renaissance as maybe being in isolated, if you will. It's sort of like it just happened. But there apparently is this longer tradition of music in the medieval period. Where do you want to start with that?
So I think when you're talking about music in the Middle Ages, the church and sacred chant is the number one thing that comes up. And the reason for this is because virtually all records that were being kept in the Middle Ages were in monasteries. And so when you're talking about what we know about music from this period, you're mostly talking about sacred chant. And to that end, there's an interesting story about Charlemagne and how he used the sacred Roman chant as a way to sort of politically unify his empire.
Editor Michael here, and I'm going to be popping in a couple times during this episode to play you a few sample clips of the music that Robert is talking about. I'm sure that YouTube will try to flag it. I'm just going to play small portions, and I'm going to credit the artist below. And Robert W. Rust, who has joined me on this episode, is a composer from the Pacific Northwest. If you'd like to follow him, the link will be in the description as well. And he is at @RWalterRust on X. This is episode 2 of Just Feudal Things, and you can look for new episodes on the 3rd and 17th of each month. That's basically 2-week intervals. To tell you the truth, I didn't know if this episode was going to make it because music is not a subject that I really know anything about, but I found the conversation to be extremely fascinating, and I think you're going to enjoy it as well. And now, back to the story on Charlemagne and our exploration of medieval music.
It's the 8th century. He's ruling over a kingdom stretching from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. But he has this vision to sort of standardize the sacred chant in his region. So he reaches out to Pope Adrian I to request these cantors, which are basically just singers. These are people who are trained in singing the sacred chant in the liturgy of the church.
And here I'm going to play for you a quick sample of the sacred chant.
And so he reaches out to Pope Adrian I, requesting these cantors to come up to his lands. And so the Pope certainly understands the importance of having good relationships with the new emperor. So a number of cantors are sent north. One of them in particular, named Romanus, gets sick on the way north. They were heading to a monastery in Metz. But Romanus gets sick near Lake Como in northern Italy, and he diverts to an abbey called St. Gul. And it's here that now St. Gul is, at this time, St. Gul is actually a very new abbey. And it's now set down a path to become one of the most important centers for music for the next few centuries. While at St. Gul, Romanus, he teaches certainly the sacred chant. He's impressed by the singing of the Franks and kind of sets out this tradition of innovation that goes on at St. Gul. And in fact, the Abbey of St Gul is still one of the most important centers for research into the Middle Ages. I think it's the only example of that has a medieval library that has been continuously maintained since its founding. So they have documents going back 1,300 years. Because most of the time, these libraries, they're made of wood, and so they burn down, and so a lot of information gets destroyed over time. But St. Gall has remained pretty much intact ever since it was founded.
That's pretty incredible. I didn't know that they had trained singers in the day of Charlemagne.
Yeah, it was. It's because the Roman liturgy and the Roman Catholic Church, which had influences in northern or in Europe prior to Charlemagne. There was chant traditions, usually referred to as Merovingian chant, that predated the Carolingian Empire, but these were seen to be as sort of like corrupted, whereas the chant in Rome, this is Gregorian chant, what we're talking about here, that's the source. It's Gregorian chant, direct from Saint Gregory, who wrote it down directly from God.
So the Gregorian chants that we have today, let's say if I go on YouTube and just pull up Gregorian chants, and let's assume that it's somebody who's trying to do, I guess, an authentic Gregorian chant, not just whatever pulls up Gregorian synthwave or something, but like an actual Gregorian chant. How similar would that be to the original Gregorian chants, or how has that changed over time?
It's very likely that it's quite accurate to what they would have been singing back then.
And here's a sample of Gregorian chant.
Over time, now at the time when the chant was first developed and the liturgy was first formed, they didn't have a notation to actually write down the notes. And so for several hundred years, it was an oral tradition that was taught by rote to people, to the monks in monasteries. It eventually became clear around the year 900 to 1000 that there was a need for a more precise notation. Sing these notes, sing these intervals. And so that's sort of how we get the development of the roots of our modern music notation, was this need to preserve the sacred chant so that it can be taught to future monks.
So everything, let's say most music then really has sprung from this Gregorian chant tradition.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, and it's and that's not to say that there isn't other music going on, because certainly there are people who are not in the monasteries. The challenge we have there is that there just aren't records for a lot of that music.
Right. Yeah. The people writing things down would have been, let's say, taking note of important social circumstances and not necessarily the musings of some wandering musician or something like that.
Mm-hmm. For the most part. Now, as you move further on until to around the 12th century, 1100 or so, we start seeing the Troubadour tradition pop up, and this is where we start seeing examples of secular music start to be recorded. Because at this point, you have a more robust system of music notation that has begun to develop, and there's also just more interest in record. It's just more people are literate, and so this information can be recorded a lot easier.
And here's a sample of some troubadour music. And so that tradition then exists completely outside the church.
Yeah, in a way, it's interesting because the troubadours, they're usually wealthier individuals. They would usually start their lives out in the secular world, but it was quite common actually for wealthy people, once they get old, they would retire to the monasteries quite often.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was reading was how Richard the Lionhart's great grandfather, William the Ninth of Aquitaine, was allegedly one of the first troubadours, or first recorded, let's say,
Hmm.
troubadours, and sort of some of his songs and poems that have come down. And so that would have been, if I recall, he went on the Second Crusade, so that was just at the very beginning of the 12th century. What sort of role did music play in medieval life then, as it was developing out into more of the secular realm?
It was largely entertainment. It didn't have the same it wasn't a liturgical kind of thing that needed to be performed exactly the same. You would have the troubadours, and there were also women troubadours, called troubarites. We have a lot fewer recorded examples of their poems, and only one recorded example of the actual notes that they would have written, that they wrote down. But they would write songs usually about courtly love, and these sorts of those sorts of things.
So this seems like it's sort of started the tradition, probably evolving over several hundred years into really like the high Middle Ages, when you have sort of the peak chivalry and
Mhm.
courtly love and that sort of thing.
Yeah, one of the and the troubadours are really kind of interesting. Reading about them, they had these things called, because these are the first time that you start seeing individuals as composers being written down and recorded. Because with the Gregorian Chant, we don't know exactly who wrote all that down. Now, tradition and legend says it was Pope Gregory who wrote it down. God, a dove came down from God and sang it to Pope Gregory, and Gregory wrote it down. You look at the volume of Gregorian Chant, though, and it's kind of it's difficult to imagine one person doing all of that. Two, Gregory wouldn't have had a notation system in order to actually write it down in the first place. So where exactly the chant tradition comes from as individuals isn't known. But the troubadours, we actually get, names and that kind of thing start propping up.
So who are some of the most significant early ones then?
A great example, there's when you read, there's these things called Vedas that are basically tiny little biographies of troubadours. And, these are just sort of really interesting stories about their lives. So, for example, there's a Guillaume de Castaban. He was a knight from the region of Rousson. And it's interesting when you read these Vedas, they don't always necessarily talk about the music that these individuals wrote. But it talks about, these interesting little snippets, snapshots of their life. So, for example, this guy, Guillaume, fell in love with a woman, and he wrote songs and poems about her. But she was married to a kind of angry and bitter, wicked nobleman. And at one point, this nobleman, he's passing by Guillaume, and Guillaume isn't, they're kind of alone. And so the nobleman strikes and kills Guillaume. And after this, Guillaume then cuts off his head, cuts out, or the nobleman cuts out cuts off his head, and he cuts out his heart, and he cooks and feeds the heart of Guillaume to his lover, which was this man's wife. And after he does this, he asks her, "Do you know what I just fed you? What you just ate?" And she doesn't. And he tells him that, I fed you the heart of Guillaume. And she's, first she's distraught. She says, "Lord, you have given me such a good thing to eat that I shall never eat again." And as he's ready to go then strike and kill his wife, she runs away to the balcony and throws herself off the balcony and dies. So this is just an example of, the kinds of the biographies of these troubadours that we find. Now, an interesting thing, because if you were to go onto YouTube and listen to troubadour songs, what you're listening to is not exactly what they probably have written. So you have the poetry, which is quite likely theirs. The notes, it's a little more unclear, because the sources that we have for the poetry come from the years 1100 to 1300. but we don't actually start seeing the notation start showing up a couple hundred years later. And then there's the other challenge that these melodies were the music that they wrote was essentially just a single line, just like if one person was singing. It wouldn't have like an instrumental accompaniment, like someone on lute or like a violin in the background or something like that. So when you listen to recordings of the troubadour songs, those are there's sort of like an interpretation that has to go on there.
What was the first instruments? Actually, it sounds like it was really dangerous to be a troubadour, first of all.
Oh yeah.
But what were some of the first instruments then that evolved once they started getting away from the Gregorian chant? Because I think when I think about this, like we talked about a little bit before we started recording, I don't know really anything technical about music. So when I think about medieval music, you think it's sort of like a stereotype, I guess. You think about like a Renaissance fair or like Disney's King Arthur, or where Robin Hood, where he's they've got like the rooster playing the little harp or whatever it is, stuff like that. So what sort of musical instruments sort of developed out of that? What did they actually use? What was that kind of like?
So they had flutes, they had stringed instruments, things that are kind of like a violin. They had harps. Now we don't actually have physical examples of a lot of these, of really any of these instruments. We don't start having, actual period copies of instruments showing up until around the 15th century. And so by that time, we're really kind of getting into the Renaissance. But we know they had instruments because we can look at iconography. We can see, pictures that they drew, and we can see, examples of people playing flutes, playing, various harps and stringed instruments. What we don't know is necessarily precisely how these instruments were played. We don't know. We don't know if the iconography actually represents reality very well, because a lot of the iconography, the pictures that people would draw down at this time, would be so full of symbolism that it can be difficult to distinguish what is a symbol with what is representing something real.
Right, like when you have the picture of the knight jousting the giant snail. You don't know if that's you don't know how that relates to then the picture of, I guess, the knight playing the lute or the flute or whatever is the case.
Yeah, one of the things we can see from the iconography, that is somewhat likely, is that it was a fairly diverse crowd. So you had, you can see depictions of, Christians playing instruments and Jews playing instruments and Muslims playing instruments. You can see that just in the way that the individuals are depicted in pictures, but that doesn't necessarily tell us how these instruments were played, how these instruments were used as accompaniments with the voice.
Interesting. So it sort of has been a process then, because when you're saying notation, you're referring to the music written down, right?
Yeah, it's whenever you see musicians nowadays playing off of like a score, that's just music notation. It's how do you get these symbols translating into the sounds you make.
Okay, so so what you're saying then is that we have the poems, or let's say they're words, but then we don't really have any actual music notation for a few hundred years later, and we also don't have any instruments, but we have pictures of the instruments. So it's almost like this puzzle of sort of putting together the pictures of the instruments with a few hundred years later of potential music accompaniment with the original poem.
Yeah. And along with that, you also have descriptions of how things sounded. Or because you do start toward the end of the Middle Ages, you start getting treatises of, this is how you sing good. And the interesting thing is that these descriptions, when they talk about, how you should position your mouth and all of that, they kind of actually go against our conventional wisdoms of, what is good singing technique. Their descriptions, if followed literally today, for most people would yield, very kind of tense and hoarse kind of sounds. The idea of like you should sing with a big wide open mouth, and that's not necessarily conventional singing technique nowadays. But again, that's kind of the puzzle here. It's just sort of like, well, what did the author think of as a wide open mouth? And so it's certainly a challenge, but I think it's really exciting because there's a certain amount of creativity that has to go into interpreting these things. Because especially if you're a musician who's going to try to perform some of this stuff, nowadays you want to create a compelling performance, and so there is a certain amount of interpretation that you don't necessarily run into with later musics, from like Bach, Mozart, those kind of things that we're more familiar with.
Right. So I had sent you a recording, which I'll probably play a quick snippet here. We'll insert it so people can hear it, of a song that was allegedly written by Richard the Lionheart.
Comme folk pouvait-il faire chanson? Nous tes amis, mes pauvres solidons.
How do you feel about that as far as its authenticity, how it would have sounded at the time, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I looked into this a little bit, and I think it seems pretty clear that the poem is definitely Richard the Lionheart. That I think is pretty much undisputed. The melody that is sung in there is also a melody that has traditionally been associated with that poem. Then there's the kind of instrumental accompaniment background, which is more what the artist kind of decided, how they decided to produce it.
Interesting. So that,
but I think you can definitely say the words are his, and there's no reason, there's no evidence to say the melody for the voice definitely is not
sure
his.
So I guess so the actual instrumental stuff is sort of up to interpretation, but everything else, I guess, is authentically without any real deviations that would be obvious to people, are pretty authentic.
Yeah. And I don't think you necessarily have to say, even though the instrumentals aren't literally what he would have written down, that isn't even necessarily like a knock against him. There's, a large, even nowadays, tradition of you just have a single melody voice, and then your instruments are going to be improvising the accompaniment to it. So, improvised accompaniments to just a monophonic, a single melody, doesn't mean that he definitely didn't write all of this. It'd be perfectly accurate to say that recording reflects what he wrote.
That's pretty interesting. That's also pretty awesome to sort of get a little bit of that link to the past in that way. Would it have been common for nobles or elites to have been trained in music in that way, or would that have been more of a hobby thing?
Yeah, they wouldn't have done it professionally. Being a musician, if you're a professional musician, that's like low of the low. You're like a servant caste, low on the caste. That doesn't mean that your nobles would not have been good. Your nobles probably would have been very good performers, though. From Middle Ages, but through onto the Renaissance and the Baroque, music was a leisure activity, and so amateur musicians, these are usually wealthier people who have a lot of time on their hands to play music and practice. And so amateur musicians during this very broad period could easily be excellent performers and musicians in their own right. They just wouldn't be putting that stuff out there just because, that profession would be seen as lower class.
Music is lower status generally, but it's a leisure activity that if you had leisure time, it would be reasonable to be proficient in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And eventually, it's the kind of thing that you would expect someone of nobility to be proficient in these sorts of things. They're just not going to be making a living doing it.
Sure.
Or publishing all of that.
That was one of the things that I found really interesting reading a biography of Henry VIII, which I realize we're sort of getting out of the medieval period into that transitionary period, early modern. I was really struck by just how, I guess, sort of in the common mind, the way that we perceive him is just sort of this cartoonish villain, but
Mhm.
he was actually one of the best jousters, tournament jousters in England. He was a fantastic athlete. He loved singing and dancing and goofing around, doing all this stuff. He was prolific, if mostly losing gambler. Just sort of all of these other different things that he had going on, which included, I don't recall if he played music, but he definitely was a singer and loved dancing and all of those sorts of things that you wouldn't normally think about, I guess, kind of along those lines.
Yeah, we sometimes, can view the nobility in our, early history as being kind of buffoonish and not having, just kind of, they have the money and they're just kind of at the top, they just kind of lie around and, get entertained. But, entertaining yourself often involves doing things. And music was one of those doing things that people would entertain themselves with.
Yeah, that's super interesting because, I guess thinking about it, that like you just sort of referenced that cartoon stereotype, like these nobles were just sort of like they just sat around and laughed with their money or something.
Mm-hmm.
But they actually, they sang, they danced, they did all these other, played cards or played games or, there's like the pictures of them playing chess at various times or things like that you don't really think about, that they had this sort of more robust catalog of activities, which included music.
Mm-hmm.
So how did the medieval music then, as it's developing, how did that maybe turn in or spark music in the Renaissance, or what we might think of then as classical music?
Yeah. So right now, the early music, when you're talking about chant, when you're talking about the troubadour songs, this is monophonic music. So just a single line, single melody, one voice. There might be in some cases instruments accompanying that, but that instrumental accompaniment wouldn't have been written down. But what you eventually start happening, and this is more in the church, and especially in it's sometimes called the Notre Dame School of Polyphony, associated with Notre Dame, Paris, is, okay, so we can sing one line, we're going to sing now two melodies that are the same melody, but we're going to separate them by some interval, usually like a perfect fifth or a perfect fourth. And it creates this very kind of open sound. And it's basically just one melody kind of doubled, so they're singing two different pitches, but they're kind of just tracking each other perfectly along that way. And at some point they develop, okay, well, now we can actually have these melodies doing different things as they sing along. And so this develops this is polyphony. So monophony, one sound, polyphony, multiple sounds. And this is really kind of how we start getting into our classical music, because now music is not just a single lines, a single melody. We start having multiple melodies and multiple people, and significantly people actually start writing this down. And so around the 14th century that you start getting, you see it in the 13th century as well, but polyphonic masses being written down and presumably performed.
How then does that incorporate the instrumentation?
So the instrumentation would have been voices. So in the church, it would have just been the voices.
Oh,
just singing.
When was the first when do they consider sort of the beginning of classical music?
So here you have to sort of define your terminology here. By classical music, we have the classical period, which generally starts around the end of the 18th century. So you can think like Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, that's like classical period. But classical music as a broader term would accompany Bach. It would be even pre-Bach in some cases.
What's the time period for Bach?
Bach, this is late 17th century through to the mid 18th century.
So music had a much later renaissance, essentially, than maybe science or religion or these other things.
In a way, I mean, you go back into the early 17th century with Monteverdi, and you start having a lot of really kind of significant changes. There was a lot of one of the big things. If you want to track, the big developments of music, you want to look at the development of opera, because opera just throughout Europe was, the invention of opera kind of happened around late 1500s and the 1600s. And that was a big turning point because opera would just become the major musical, theatrical entertainment source for, basically until the 20th century. And so that was a very big moment when opera was developed.
And so that developed, you said, end of the 16th century?
Yeah, in the 15th, and it's really quite accurate to say invented. It wasn't even, it was a very active, it was something intentional. You had a lot of theorists and people who were rediscovering Greek music and Greek theater, and wanting to bring some of that kind of revived Greek theater in a way. They were dissatisfied with a lot of the music that they had there at their time, which was very polyphonic. So you had a lot of different singing happening at the same time, and so the words could get really muddy, and you don't necessarily know what everyone's singing. What they want to do is they want an art form where the words are very intelligible. And so this is where opera comes from. And it was a very intentional thing that they wanted to make vocal music where you have all your instruments are now all being written out, but your words are going to be heard and understood.
Did that come out of then more of the Troubadour tradition they were trying to get out, or the Gregorian Chant tradition?
No, so the Troubadours actually were quite long gone at this point.
Oh,
Um,
what happened to them?
the tradition just sort of kind of fizzled out. It was a very kind of brief moment in music history where you had these sort of traveling noble singers.
Huh. Okay.
And so a lot of this was related. This was the church music, sacred music.
Okay, so the Troubadours, that was just a brief period of time. And then, but then a lot of the music, really like, let's say the music tradition carries on through this Gregorian chanting, through the mass, through the church. And then they develop that polyphonic method. And then basically they invent opera as a rebellion to that.
Yeah, I'd say not necessarily a rebellion, but like a reaction.
Okay.
They're reacting to what at the time, the polyphonic music was becoming so big and so complicated that they wanted to strip away everything and get back to what, the essential means of expression.
Wow, I'm like floored by the appearance and then sudden disappearance of the Troubadours. That was a plot twist I didn't see coming.
Yeah, it's a very brief kind of little blip, but I think it's really, really kind of defines the sound. It defines, something about the Middle Ages, and especially because when you look at the subject of the poetry of, like courtly love, and it's really kind of what the Middle Ages, I think, was about in many ways, especially if you want to look outside the church.
Yeah, it reminds me of Buskers today. That's what it makes me think of.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Huh. And so I guess buskers today are just sort of that tradition didn't carry on. They stopped, and then I don't know, whatever, 500 years later, they're like, yeah, let's start wandering around and playing music again.
Something like that.
I guess what else should we know about music in the medieval period?
I was going to say the really essential thing if you want to understand music in the Middle Ages is you have to listen to Gregorian chant and then early medieval polyphony. It's because it's hard to say, what was the sound of the Middle Ages when we don't have records, a complete picture of what it all sounded like. We know the chant, and it's because that's recorded, but we don't really know much of anything else. And like I said, even with the Troubadours, we have a lot more of the poetry, not that much of the actual notes, the music that they would have sung to those words.
What's sort of the lasting effect of music in the medieval period as we sort of get further on into the Renaissance and even further? How is that music of that period influenced maybe even what we have today at all?
The lasting effect is the development of polyphony.
And here's a brief sample of polyphony.
That is, I think, that is by far the most significant thing. That and then the development of music notation. Both of those things are really essential, because you have this idea of we can sing multiple things at the same time, and we can write our music down.
When did the music notation start?
So music notation, they had little versions of it, which kind of look like little scribbles. These are called neumes. And you can almost think of these as like just little reminders of like a little squiggle that goes up, and this is like, okay, I know when I get to this word, the pitch goes up, but it's not actually telling you which notes you need to sing. Now, eventually, they started putting these on a staff. So if you've ever seen, examples of like modern music notation, you have those 5 lines. It's a lot like that, where they would put, these little dots on the lines and spaces that would tell you which notes to sing. But you still don't necessarily have exactly rhythm being explicitly identified yet. And then toward the later Middle Ages, systems of rhythmic notation start to develop. One interesting thing we have from the Troubadours, because we can read their poetry, we can see what they're writing about. And so one of the things we can see that, in the early poetry, they talk a lot about nature as a subject that comes up a lot. And toward the end, and there's this adoration of nature. That's this beautiful thing that's there, that they see it, that they love it. And toward the end of the Troubadour tradition, we start seeing there's a lot more prevalence of, one nature starts to be absent from their writings. And they're writing more about things in the city and life in the city. And this is what this indicates, and it goes along with some more scientific information that we have about the period, that in the early Middle Ages, you kind of had a warmer period in Europe, and smaller population centers that then begin to grow rapidly. So, for example, Paris started off small, but because the weather was warm, it meant that you could grow more food. It meant populations could grow a lot. And if populations grow a lot, cities expand. And so there starts to actually become a sort of kind of destruction of the natural landscape. And we can actually see that sort of happen by reading through the Troubadour poetry.
I hadn't even thought about that from that angle at all.
Well, I highly recommend, looking up the Abbey of St Gul, and looking up kind of what monastic life, because that's another big part of medieval history and medieval life. And the reason St. Gul is so important is you can go on their website. They have, high resolution scans of a lot of the manuscripts there. So you can actually, see exactly what these 10th century monks were writing down. And one of the interesting things, too, about St. Gul, there was an interesting period in the 10th century, I think it was around 926, when the Hungarians, they were kind of wreaking havoc all over Europe at the time, and they invade and they basically burn the Abbey of St. Gul to the ground. The library survives, which is why we still have all of that, but they burn it to the ground. There's an interesting story about a monk named Haribald, who he's a little bit of a dull-witted guy, and because he hadn't been given leather for his shoes, refuses to evacuate as the Hungarians are coming and invading. And but the Hungarians, they realize, oh, this guy's kind of just a buffoon, and so they kind of keep him around as a laughing stock. And so he eventually kind of gets taken away along with another cleric who is actually able to speak the Hungarians' language. And on a period in the night, Haribald and this cleric are listening to the Hungarians kind of, they're eating and they're kind of getting into all of these kind of chaotic, shouting and angry kind of just terrible sounding noises is kind of how it's described, singing, their various musics and all that kind of stuff. But Haribald and this cleric break out into chanting an example, one of the sacred chants. And it actually, in the way it's described in the story, is that it kind of causes a calm and a pause to come over the entire camp that ultimately leads to both the cleric and Haribald being able to get away and escape their captors. And so, that's an interesting kind of period out of the Abbey of St Gul. Was in a manuscript called the Kasus Sagali by Ekkehard IV.
I've heard of Ekkehard IV. Didn't he write, is that the one that he wrote the big history of the monastery, or he wrote something like that, or was that a different Ekkehard?
Probably was a different Ekkehard. Yeah, this is an interesting, you have a lot of different, single name people, and so you're just Ekkehard 4,
Right.
5, 6. Sometimes they don't even have names, and so it's like Anonymous 2 and all that kind of stuff.
Anonymous too.
Yeah, funny. So one of the most influential scholars of the Middle Ages, Anonymous 2, that kind of thing.
Is there any other stories that you know of where music plays a big part like that?
There's another one. It's the story of Victor and Carlo, and Victor and Carlo. They're both monks, and they kind of get into a spat. And at some point, Victor comes along. Carlo is sort of kind of like a corrupt monk. He's, not a very good guy. And Carlo is like, pointing this out. And, but because Carlo has a lot of power, he's kind of, able to take things out on Victor. But a turning point in the story comes when Victor actually starts singing a sacred chant. And that kind of gets all of the other monks to sort of change their minds and sort of turn on Carlo. And he eventually gets kind of banished and exiled from the abbey.
I just remembered now, I should have looked this up before we started, but I just remembered now of, if I recall correctly, when Richard the Lionheart was imprisoned, they were trying to find out where he was imprisoned at, and they sent his minstrel Blondel, or he just went off on his own. I can't remember which, if they sent him or if he went off on his own, and he was singing these songs outside of various prisons of these castles, just going around until Richard apparently heard him singing this line out of the castle, and he sang, the responding line that then which Blondel knew, because he could hear Richard sing it, and he like went and reported back, and that's how they found out. That's how everyone else found out that he was actually imprisoned by the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna or wherever around in there, wherever he was imprisoned, was through his minstrel Blondel.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, I don't know if that actually happened, the actual historical accuracy, but it's interesting, I think, just how frequently music shows up as a turning point in the stories told in the Middle Ages. Exactly how precise, these stories are is, up for debate, but something that's very clear is that music was kind of an important moral tool and something that could be very persuasive.
Was there very much history, like I know you mentioned like being able to analyze the songs of the Troubadors and sort of get this picture of nature and cities and stuff like that, but were there any histories like the Song of Roland type of thing that were passed down through music?
One of the things that the text that they would often choose, the text weren't always necessarily like fancy poetry. Sometimes the text were like, genealogies, or it's like, here's these lists of important people. And so you listen to the music and, obviously it's in Latin. So, when we listen to it nowadays, we can't understand the words, but it's just like, oh, this sounds very profound. This is really nice. But then you look at the lyrics, it's just like, this is like a bibliography. There's nothing actually very interesting about the text, but they would set these kind of mundane, boring things to really quite beautiful music.
Well, that's probably a good place to wrap it up. I'll leave you with the last word of anything else that you think that would be good for anybody else to know about medieval music? A story, a theory, anything that you think is important or insightful for us to know?
I think you just need to go listen to it. Find Gregorian Chant, find Troubadour songs, and just listen. Music. It's not really about theories. It's not. I mean, I'm a composer, and I make little theories about music all the time and all that. But it's the actual listening is the really important part, and it's a really exciting part of music history, because we do have to rediscover things and invent things and interpret things. You can have a really good time, listening to even different interpretations of, how did people sing Gregorian chant in this style in this region versus, other regions.
Comme folle pouvait-il faire chanson? Nous tes amis, mes pauvres sont